The early morning light filtered through the tall windows of Kensington Palace as Princess Catherine sat in the small breakfast room, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long gone cold. She stared at the newspaper on the table, though her eyes weren't really seeing the words. The headline spoke of another crisis, another family in need, another tragedy that seemed to multiply by the day in their country. William entered quietly, his footsteps barely audible on the polished floor, and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. She looked up at him with those expressive eyes that had captured the nation's heart years ago. But now they held a weight that came from truly understanding the responsibility they carried. They had spent the previous evening reading letters from families across Britain, stories of loss and struggle that had moved them both to tears. One letter in particular had stayed with Catherine through the night, keeping sleep at bay. It was from a mother whose teenage son had taken his own life after battling depression in silence. Too ashamed to ask for help, William pulled out the chair beside her and sat down, not speaking at first. They had learned over the years of their marriage that sometimes silence was the most powerful form of communication between them. He reached for her hand, intertwining his fingers with hers in that familiar gesture that grounded them both. The weight of the crown, even before it officially rested on their heads, pressed down on them in moments like these. They were more than just public figures or ceremonial leaders. They had chosen to be voices for the voiceless, advocates for those struggling in the shadows. Catherine finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. She told William that she wanted to visit the family who had written the letter, to sit with them, to listen to their story without cameras or official protocols. She wanted to be simply Kate, a mother who understood the fierce love and desperate fear that came with raising children in an increasingly complex world. William squeezed her hand, his own eyes reflecting the determination he saw in hers. He had fallen in love with her compassion long before the wedding, but watching it deepen and strengthen through the years had only increased his admiration. They spent the next hour planning quietly, knowing their private secretary would have concerns about security and scheduling. But some things mattered more than convenience or tradition. They had 3 children of their own now, and the thought of losing any of them was unbearable. If sitting with grieving parents could bring even a small measure of comfort, if their presence could help remove the stigma around mental health struggles, then protocols could be adjusted by mid-morning. The arrangements were made with the discretion their team had perfected over the years. No press release, no photo opportunity. Just 2 parents reaching out to 2 other parents across the vast divide that usually separated royalty from ordinary citizens. Catherine changed into simple clothes, a navy sweater and jeans that wouldn't draw attention, and William dressed similarly. They looked at each other in the mirror, not as the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge, but as William and Kate. 2 people trying to make a meaningful difference. The drive to the modest home in a quiet suburb of London took less than an hour, but it felt like crossing into another world. The streets were lined with terraced houses, small gardens, cars parked closely together. This was real Britain. It's the Britain that didn't often see the inside of palaces, but carried the weight of daily struggles with quiet dignity. Their protection officers maintained a discreet distance as William and Catherine approached the blue door of number 47. A woman in her mid-40s opened the door, her face showing surprise, despite having been told they were coming. Sarah Mitchell had written the letter 3 weeks ago in a moment of desperate grief, never imagining it would lead to this moment. Her husband James appeared behind her, his eyes red-rimmed and weary. Catherine stepped forward first, and instead of offering a formal handshake, she simply opened her arms. Sarah collapsed into the embrace, sobbing against the shoulder of the future queen. Releasing grief that had been bottled up behind the brave face, she showed the world. William stood with James, their hands clasped in a firm grip that conveyed understanding beyond words. They moved into the small sitting room, where photographs of a bright-eyed boy covered every surface. Thomas Mitchell smiled out from school pictures, football team photos, family holidays at the seaside. 15 years of life captured in frames, a story cut tragically short. Catherine sat on the worn sofa beside Sarah, holding her hand while the mother spoke about her son in a voice that trembled and broke and carried on anyway. Thomas had been clever and kind, popular at school, but secretly struggling with anxiety that he hid from everyone. He had been afraid of being seen as weak, afraid of letting his parents down, afraid of the stigma that still surrounded mental health despite all the awareness campaigns. The night he died, he had seemed almost normal at dinner, laughing at his father's jokes, helping his younger sister with homework. There had been no dramatic warning signs, no clear moment when intervention could have changed the outcome. William listened with his full attention, occasionally asking quiet questions that showed he wasn't just being polite, but truly trying to understand. He spoke about his own struggles after his mother's death, the years of pushing down grief and anger because he thought that was what being strong meant. He talked about learning much later than he should have, that asking for help wasn't weakness but wisdom. His voice carried the weight of genuine experience. Not rehearsed talking points from a briefing document, Catherine asked to see Thomas's room, and Sarah led her upstairs with hesitant steps. The room was exactly as he had left it, frozen in time like a shrine to a life unlived. Posters of football players and bands covered the walls. Now school books were stacked on the desk, and a guitar leaned in the corner. Catherine stood in the center of the small room and cried openly, making no attempt to hide her tears or compose herself into royal dignity. Sarah cried with her, and in that shared grief, something profound passed between them. They stayed for over 3 hours, far longer than scheduled, drinking tea and looking at photo albums and hearing stories about a boy they would never meet but would never forget. When they finally prepared to leave, Catherine hugged Sarah again and made a promise. She would use her platform to talk about youth mental health with even more determination, to help create a society where no child felt they had to suffer in silence. William shook James's hand and then pulled him into a brief, tight embrace that said everything words couldn't, as they drove back through London's streets. William and Catherine sat in silence once more, their hands clasped between them. Both had tears on their faces, but also a renewed sense of purpose. They had been changed by this encounter, reminded viscerally why they had chosen to focus their charitable work on mental health and family support. The palace could wait. The official duties and ceremonial obligations would still be there tomorrow. Today, they had been exactly where they needed to be, offering grace and compassion in the way that mattered most. The following week brought a packed schedule of official engagements, but William and Catherine carried the memory of the Mitchells with them through every handshake and ribbon cutting. They attended a gala for a children's hospital where Catherine spoke with parents, waiting anxiously for news about their sick children. She sat with them in the family waiting room, ignoring the hovering aide who kept glancing at her watch, knowing they were running behind schedule. There was a young father whose daughter was in surgery, his leg bouncing nervously as he checked his phone every few seconds. Catherine asked about his daughter, and the man's face transformed as he spoke about Lily, age 7, who loved dancing and wanted to be a veterinarian when she grew up. She was having heart surgery, a procedure that had a good success rate, but still carried risks that terrified her parents. His wife was in the surgical waiting area, unable to leave in case the doctors came with news. He had come to the family room to call his mother, to update relatives. To escape for just a moment from the crushing anxiety, she listened to him with the same complete attention. She had given Sarah Mitchell, asking questions about Lily's personality, her favorite subjects at school, whether she had siblings. The man relaxed slightly as he talked, grateful for the distraction from his fear. Catherine shared a story about George's first day at school. How nervous she had been, how she had cried in the car afterward, even though it was just school and not surgery. The man smiled for the first time, recognizing the universal experience of parental worry that transcended all social boundaries. William was upstairs touring the new pediatric wing, but his mind was partially elsewhere. He paused by the window of a room where a teenage boy sat alone, staring at a handheld gaming device without really playing. The protection officer started to move them along, but William held up a hand and knocked gently on the doorframe. The boy looked up, his eyes widening as he recognized who stood there. William asked if he could come in, and the boy nodded, suddenly self-conscious about his hospital gown and the IV line in his arm. They talked about the game first, a safe topic that let them establish rapport. The boy, Marcus, was 14 and recovering from a suicide attempt. He had taken an overdose of pills 3 days ago, survived because his little brother found him and called for help. and was now in the psychiatric unit, waiting for a bed to open at a specialized facility. He hadn't wanted to talk to the hospital counselors or his parents, or anyone really. But something about William's quiet presence and genuine interest made the words start flowing. Marcus talked about the pressure he felt at school, the constant anxiety about grades and university applications and living up to expectations. He talked about feeling like he was drowning in demands and deadlines, like there was no escape except the one he had tried to take. He cried as he spoke, embarrassed by his tears, but unable to stop them. William pulled a chair close to the bed and listened, occasionally sharing his own experiences with anxiety and the therapy he had done to manage it. He told Marcus about the darkest period after his mother died, when he was angry at the world and himself and couldn't see a way forward. He talked about learning that mental health was just as important as physical health, and taking medication for anxiety was no different than taking insulin for diabetes. He spoke about the relief of finally being honest about his struggles instead of pretending everything was fine. Marcus listened with an intensity that showed how desperately he needed to hear these words from someone he respected. When William finally left the room, 45 minutes later, significantly behind schedule, he found Catherine waiting in the hallway. She had finished with the parents in the family room and come looking for him, somehow knowing he would need a moment to decompress. They stepped into an empty office, and William told her about Marcus, his voice rough with emotion. She held him while he processed what he had heard, offering the same compassionate presence she gave to everyone else. Their protection officer informed them they needed to leave immediately to make their next engagement, a visit to a youth center across town. They were already running 30 minutes late, which would throw off the entire carefully planned schedule. William and Catherine exchanged a glance and made a silent decision. They asked their aide to call ahead and apologize for the delay, explaining honestly that they had been with families at the hospital and needed more time than anticipated. The youth center would understand, and if they didn't, that was unfortunate. It's secondary to being fully present where they were needed. The youth center was in a rough part of East London, an area that struggled with gang violence, poverty, and limited opportunities for young people. The center provided a safe space for teenagers to gather, offering mentorship programs, educational support, and activities that kept them engaged and off the streets. William and Catherine had visited several times over the years, building relationships with the staff and some of the regular attendees. A girl named Jasmine was there, now 17, who they had first met when she was 13 and barely spoke above a whisper. She had been in foster care after being removed from an abusive home. Angry at the world and convinced no one cared about her future, over the years, Catherine had stayed in touch through the center's staff, sending occasional messages of encouragement and attending events where Jasmine was performing or presenting. Jasmine had transformed, gaining confidence and discovering a talent for spoken word poetry that gave her a powerful voice. She performed one of her pieces for William and Catherine, a raw and honest exploration of growing up in care, feeling unwanted and invisible, and finding strength through creative expression. Her words were fierce and beautiful, holding nothing back as she described the reality of her experiences. When she finished, the room was silent for a long moment before erupting in applause. Catherine approached Jasmine afterward, pulling her into a hug that the teenager initially stiffened against before relaxing into. They talked about Jasmine's plans for university, her dreams of becoming a social worker to help other children in care, her continuing relationship with her foster family, who had given her stability and love. Catherine asked detailed questions about the application process, offering to write a recommendation letter if it would help, treating Jasmine not as a charity case but as a capable young woman with a bright future. William spent time with a group of boys who were part of a football program designed to teach teamwork and conflict resolution through sport. Many of them had been involved with gangs or were at risk of recruitment, drawn to the sense of belonging and protection that gangs offered in neighborhoods where legitimate opportunities felt out of reach. The program gave them an alternative community, mentors who cared about their well-being, and skills that could translate into jobs or further education. One of the boys, Andre, had lost his older brother to knife crime 2 years ago. He had been on the edge of seeking revenge, pulled toward violence by grief and rage. When a youth worker at the center had intervened, the worker had been relentless in reaching out, showing up consistently, even when Andre pushed him away, offering support without judgment until the teenager finally accepted help. Andre now worked as a mentor himself, using his story to reach other young people heading down the same dangerous path. He spoke with William about the cycle of violence in his community, the way poverty and lack of opportunity created conditions where young people felt they had no choice but to join gangs for protection and income. He talked about friends who had been killed or imprisoned, lives cut short or derailed before they really began. But he also spoke with hope about the difference programs like this could make, about young people who were finding better paths. When given support and alternatives, William listened with the same intense focus he had given Marcus at the hospital, asking questions that showed he understood the complexity of the issues. He didn't offer simple solutions or make promises he couldn't keep. Instead, he acknowledged the difficulty of the challenges these young people faced and expressed admiration for their resilience and determination to create better futures. His respect was genuine, not performative, and the teenagers responded to that authenticity as the afternoon stretched into evening. William and Catherine moved through the center, meeting young people and staff, listening to stories, and offering encouragement. They played table tennis with a group of girls, helped with homework in the study room, and sat through an impromptu rap performance by boys who wanted to show off their skills. They were relaxed and present, laughing and engaging without the formality that often characterized royal visits. When they finally prepared to leave, much later than scheduled, the director of the center thanked them for their time. Catherine hugged her and said the thanks should go to the staff and young people who did the real work every day. She meant it sincerely, understanding that their royal visits brought attention and funding, but the transformation of young lives happened through the consistent, unglamorous daily effort of people who rarely received recognition. The drive back to Kensington Palace was quiet, both of them exhausted but filled with a sense of purpose. They had missed a dinner engagement with a foreign dignitary, something that would require diplomatic apologies. The impact of their visit to the Mitchell family rippled outward in ways they hadn't fully anticipated. Sarah Mitchell had mentioned the visit to a close friend, mentioned it to someone else, and within days the story had spread through their community. Families who had lost children to suicide or were supporting teenagers with mental health struggles began reaching out, asking if there was any way to connect with others who understood their pain. A local mother, Emma Richardson, contacted the mental health charity that William and Catherine supported, suggesting they needed a support group specifically for bereaved parents. Catherine received a briefing about the request during a morning meeting at Kensington Palace. She immediately asked her private secretary to arrange a meeting with Emma and anyone else interested in forming such a group. 2 weeks later, she sat in a church hall in North London with 15 parents who had lost children to suicide. There were no cameras, no official photographers, just folding chairs in a circle and tea in chipped mugs. She had insisted on no media presence, wanting these parents to feel safe sharing their grief without worry about public exposure. The stories poured out, each one unique, but united by threads of devastating loss and questioning that would never have satisfactory answers. A father whose son had jumped from a bridge after being bullied at school. A mother whose daughter had seemed fine until the day she wasn't, leaving behind a note that explained nothing. A couple whose teenage son had struggled with depression for years before finally succumbing to it. Catherine listened to each story with tears streaming down her face. Making no attempt to hide her emotional response, she shared her own experience of loss, talking about the grandmother she had been close to and how grief had ambushed her at unexpected moments for years afterward. She acknowledged that her loss was different, that losing a grandparent to old age couldn't compare to losing a child to suicide. But she wanted them to know she understood something of grief's unpredictable nature. More importantly, she asked what they needed. What would actually help, rather than what sounded good in theory? The answers were practical and heartbreaking. They needed spaces to talk without judgment, without people offering platitudes about time-healing wounds or their children being in a better place. They needed support groups that met regularly, not just once or twice, but ongoing, because grief didn't follow a schedule. They needed help navigating the complex emotions of guilt, anger, and devastating sadness that came in waves. They needed society to stop treating suicide as a shameful secret and start treating it as the mental health crisis it was. Catherine took notes on a small pad, writing down everything they said. She promised to work with the mental health charity to establish regular support groups, to ensure funding was available for trained facilitators, to help reduce the isolation that made grief even harder to bear. She stayed for 3 hours, longer than scheduled, because leaving felt like abandoning people who had already experienced too much abandonment. When she finally stood to go, every parent there hugged her, holding on perhaps a bit longer than appropriate for royalty, but exactly as long as they needed to. William, meanwhile, had returned to the hospital to visit Marcus, the teenager who had attempted suicide. He had thought about the boy constantly since their first meeting, wondering how he was doing, whether he was getting the help he needed. The visit was unofficial and unannounced, arranged quietly through the hospital's administration. Marcus was still waiting for a bed at the specialized psychiatric facility. Stuck in limbo while bureaucracy slowly processed his case, the boy's face lit up when William walked into the room, then immediately tried to hide his reaction, as if showing emotion was weakness. William understood that impulse, the masculine conditioning that said feelings should be suppressed and vulnerability avoided. He sat down, and they talked about the game Marcus was playing, letting the conversation flow naturally rather than forcing discussion of heavy topics. Eventually, Marcus asked why William had come back, his voice uncertain, as if he couldn't quite believe someone important would bother with him. William answered honestly that he had been thinking about Marcus and wanted to check on him, to make sure he was okay and getting proper support. He said that Marcus's story mattered, that his life had value, that the world would be diminished by his absence. The words might have sounded trite coming from someone else, but William delivered them with such sincerity that Marcus believed them. They talked about coping strategies, about the importance of continuing therapy even when it felt pointless, about building a support network of people who understood. Marcus admitted he was terrified of leaving the hospital, of returning to the same school and same pressures that had overwhelmed him before. William asked if he had considered a fresh start, perhaps attending a different school where he could begin again without the weight of everyone knowing what had happened. The boy hadn't thought about that possibility, assuming he had no choice but to return to his old life. William promised to speak with his parents about options, to help them understand that sometimes a new environment was necessary for healing. He also told Marcus about the youth mental health initiative he and Catherine were developing, a program that would bring mental health support directly into schools, so teenagers didn't have to wait for crisis points to access help. He asked Marcus what would have made a difference for him, what kind of support might have helped before things got so dark. The teenager thought carefully before answering, describing a desire for someone to talk to who wasn't his parents or teachers, someone without authority over him, who could just listen without judgment. William wrote down Marcus's suggestions, treating them as valuable input rather than the thoughts of a troubled kid who didn't know what he needed. They talked about reducing the stigma around therapy, making it as normal as seeing a doctor for a physical ailment. Marcus mentioned that some of his friends thought therapy was for crazy people, that admitting you needed help meant you were weak. William shared his own experience with therapy, describing how it had helped him process grief and anxiety, normalizing it as a tool for mental health maintenance rather than a last resort for crisis. Before leaving, William gave Marcus his private email address, written on a card that also included the contact information for several mental health resources. He told the boy to reach out if he needed support, that someone on his staff monitored the email regularly and would make sure messages reached him. Marcus stared at the card in disbelief, unable to fully process that the future King of England was offering him direct contact. William squeezed his shoulder and reminded him that asking for help was strength, not weakness, and that he had already shown incredible courage by surviving and being willing to try recovery. That evening, William and Catherine sat together in their private sitting room at Kensington Palace, sharing the events of their day. The children were asleep, the household quiet, and they had this rare moment of peace to process everything they had experienced. Catherine described the bereaved parents' meeting, the raw grief that still consumed them months or years after their losses. William told her about Marcus and his fear of returning to normal life. His recognition that the environment that had contributed to its crisis still existed. They talked about the limitations of their positions. The frustration of seeing problems clearly but being unable to implement solutions directly. They were not elected officials who could change policies or allocate government resources. They were members of the royal family whose power was largely symbolic and whose influence depended on persuasion rather than authority. Yet they also recognized the unique platform they had. The ability to shine light on issues and inspire action in ways that few others could. Catherine had an idea that had been forming during the support group meeting. What if they created a documentary series that followed families dealing with youth mental health challenges, showing the reality of these struggles without sensationalism or exploitation? It could help reduce stigma by making these experiences visible and relatable, showing that mental health crises could happen to anyone regardless of background or circumstances. William added that they could include experts discussing warning signs and resources. Making it both personal and educational, they began sketching out the concept. Knowing it would need careful planning and consultation with mental health professionals to ensure it helped rather than harmed. They would need to find families willing to share their stories, which required enormous courage and trust. They would need to work with broadcasters who understood the sensitivity required for this kind of content. It was an ambitious project that would take months or years to bring to fruition. But they both felt energized by the possibility of creating something meaningful. The conversation shifted to their children and the world they were growing up in, a world that seemed increasingly complex and challenging. George, Charlotte, and Louis were still young, protected by privilege and security in ways most children weren't. But they would eventually face their own struggles and pressures. William and Catherine talked about how to prepare them for that reality. How to raise mentally healthy children who understood their responsibility to others, while, a month later, Catherine stood backstage at a conference center in Manchester, preparing to give a speech about youth mental health to an audience of educators, healthcare providers, and policymakers. She had given hundreds of speeches over the years, but this one felt different because it wasn't written by Palace staff. She had drafted it herself, incorporating stories from the people she had met, statistics from research she had studied, and her own observations about what needed to change. Her hands trembled slightly as she reviewed her notes one final time. Public speaking had never been her strength, unlike William, who had been trained for it since childhood. She still felt the flutter of anxiety before major addresses, worried about stumbling over words or losing her place. But she had learned that authenticity mattered more than polish, that people responded to genuine emotion, even if delivered imperfectly. She took a deep breath and walked onto the stage as her name was announced. The speech began with Sarah Mitchell's story, told with permission and with names changed to protect privacy. Catherine described receiving the letter, the visit to their home, the photographs of Thomas that covered every surface. She talked about the support group that had formed afterward, and what those bereaved parents had taught her about the long-term impact of youth suicide on families and communities. Her voice caught several times as she spoke, and she didn't try to hide her emotion or apologize for it. She moved on to discuss Marcus and other young people she had met who were struggling with mental health challenges that went unrecognized or untreated until they reached crisis points. She challenged the audience to consider why society invested so much in physical health infrastructure, but so little in mental health support. She presented data about the prevalence of anxiety and depression among teenagers, the long wait times for treatment, the shortage of trained professionals, and the persistent stigma that prevented many young people from seeking help. But the speech wasn't just about problems. Catherine outlined specific initiatives she and William were supporting through their foundation, including the school-based mental health program they were developing with input from young people like Marcus. She announced increased funding for suicide prevention programs and parent support groups. She challenged educators to integrate mental health education into standard curriculum, teaching children from a young age that emotional well-being was just as important as academic achievement. Most importantly, she called for a cultural shift in how society understood and responded to mental health struggles. She asked people to stop treating therapy as shameful and start treating it as routine health care. She urged parents to prioritize their children's emotional health, even when it conflicted with academic or extracurricular ambitions. She challenged employers and universities to create environments that supported mental well-being rather than glorifying stress and burnout as badges of honor. The audience listened in rapt silence, many wiping away tears as Catherine spoke. When she finished, the applause was thunderous and sustained, people rising to their feet in recognition of both the message and the courage it took to deliver it so personally. She smiled and waved, then quickly left the stage before emotion overwhelmed her completely. Backstage, she accepted water from an aide with shaking hands. Adrenaline still coursing through her system, William called within minutes, having watched the speech via live stream from London where he was attending other engagements. He told her she had been brilliant, that her honesty and passion had come through powerfully. She deflected the praise, saying she had simply shared what she had learned from people braver than herself. He reminded her that being willing to learn and amplify marginalized voices was its own form of courage, that she was using her platform exactly as she should. The speech generated significant media coverage, with news outlets praising Catherine's authentic approach and highlighting the specific initiatives she had announced. More importantly, it sparked conversations across the country about youth mental health. Schools began reaching out to the foundation, asking about the mental health program. Parents contacted mental health charities seeking support resources. Young people shared their own stories on social media, inspired by Catherine's openness to discuss their struggles publicly. But there was also backlash, as there always was with any high-profile advocacy work. Some critics accused Catherine of exploiting tragedy for publicity, suggesting her involvement with bereaved families was performative rather than genuine. Others questioned whether royals should be involved in policy discussions at all, arguing they should stick to ceremonial duties. A few media commentators suggested she was overstepping her role and should leave mental health advocacy to professionals. Catherine read the criticism with William beside her, both knowing this was inevitable. They discussed each critique thoughtfully, considering whether there was valid feedback to incorporate, while recognizing that some opposition came from people who would never approve of royals taking active advocacy roles, regardless of the cause or approach. William reminded her that controversy meant they were pushing boundaries and challenging norms, which was necessary for real change. They agreed to stay focused on impact rather than popularity, to measure success by lives improved rather than favorable headlines. They acknowledged they would make mistakes, that learning as they went was part of the process, but that the alternative of doing nothing was unacceptable. The platform they had been born or married into came with responsibility to use it meaningfully, and they were determined to do exactly that regardless of criticism. The following week brought a private meeting at Kensington Palace with a group of young mental health advocates, teenagers and young adults who had personal experience with various mental health conditions and were now working to support others and change systems. Catherine and William wanted their input on the school-based program and other initiatives, recognizing that those with lived experience should help shape interventions designed to help them. The group included Jasmine from the East London Youth Centre, who had become increasingly involved in mental health advocacy alongside her spoken word poetry. There was also Priya, 19-year-old university student, who had been hospitalized for an eating disorder and now ran a support group for others in recovery. Miguel, a 22-year-old who had aged out of foster care and struggled with complex PTSD, brought perspective on how childhood trauma affected long-term mental health. And there were several others, each bringing unique insights. The meeting lasted 3 hours, with Catherine and William mostly listening as the young advocates shared their experiences and suggestions. They talked about the importance of peer support, how connecting with others who truly understood their struggles had been more helpful than many professional interventions. They discussed the need for mental health education that was honest about struggles rather than superficial positivity that dismissed real challenges. They emphasized that mental health support needed to be accessible without long wait times or complex referral processes. Jasmine spoke passionately about the intersection of mental health and social circumstances, how poverty, discrimination, trauma, all affected emotional well-being in ways that couldn't be addressed through therapy alone. She challenged William and Catherine to think beyond individual treatment and consider systemic factors that contributed to mental health crises. Miguel added that young people from care backgrounds or unstable homes needed wraparound support that addressed housing, education, and employment alongside mental health. Catherine asked difficult questions about how to reach young people who were most isolated and struggling, but least likely to seek help or engage with support services. The advocates described the importance of meeting people where they were, literally and figuratively. This meant bringing services into schools and community centers. Rather than expecting teenagers to navigate complex healthcare systems, it meant using technology and social media to provide support in ways that felt natural to young people. It meant training peers to recognize warning signs and connect struggling friends to resources, William brought up. The challenge of balancing privacy concerns with the need for early intervention, particularly in schools. Parents sometimes objected to schools addressing mental health without explicit permission, worried about overreach or preferring to handle such matters privately. The advocates acknowledged this tension, but argued that waiting for parental permission could mean waiting until a crisis point. That mental health education should be part of standard curriculum, just like physical health education. The discussion grew animated as they debated various approaches, but it remained respectful and productive. Catherine took extensive notes, occasionally asking for clarification or specific examples. William engaged directly with the young people, treating them as experts rather than beneficiaries of royal charity. By the end of the meeting, they had generated a long list of recommendations that would inform the Foundation's work going forward. Before the advocates left, Catherine thanked them for their time and honesty. Acknowledging that some of what they had shared must have been difficult to discuss, Jasmine responded that it was actually empowering to be consulted genuinely had been turning points in his recovery. He had decided to train as a peer support volunteer to help other young people struggling with mental health challenges, Catherine shared the email with William immediately. Both of them moved by Marcus's progress and his decision to transform his pain into purpose. They had learned not to measure their impact by grand gestures or sweeping policy changes, but by individual lives touched and trajectories altered. Marcus was one person, but his recovery mattered infinitely, and if he went on to support other struggling teenagers, the ripple effects could extend far beyond what they could directly accomplish. They decided to invite Marcus to visit them at Kensington Palace. Wanting to celebrate his progress and learn from his experience, a week later, he arrived with his parents, all three looking nervous and overwhelmed by the surroundings. Catherine and William greeted them warmly in a private sitting room rather than formal reception areas. Wanting this to feel like a conversation among friends rather than an official audience, Marcus looked healthier than when William had last seen him. More color in his face and light in his eyes, he spoke about the new school and how starting fresh had removed the weight of everyone knowing his history. He talked about therapy and how difficult it had been at first to open up, but how helpful it became once he stopped resisting. He described the peer support training he was doing and his hope to make a difference for others the way William's visits had made a difference for him. His parents added their own perspective, talking about the fear and guilt they had experienced after his suicide attempt. They described the confusion of not understanding what their son was going through, the self-blame for not recognizing warning signs sooner, the terror of almost losing him. They also spoke about their own therapy, recognizing they needed support to process their trauma and learn better ways to communicate with Marcus about his mental health. Catherine asked what advice they would give to other parents with teenagers struggling with mental health issues. Marcus's mother spoke about the importance of listening without trying to immediately fix or dismiss concerns, taking seriously even complaints that seemed minor or attention-seeking. His father added that parents needed to educate themselves about mental health, to understand that depression and anxiety were medical conditions requiring treatment, not character flaws that could be overcome through willpower. Marcus himself addressed the importance of parents creating environments where teenagers felt safe being honest about struggles without fear of punishment or judgment. He described how he had hidden his anxiety from his parents because he worried about disappointing them or adding to their stress. He wished he had known sooner that asking for help was okay. That needing support didn't mean he was weak or failing. The conversation lasted for over 2 hours, covering everything from medication management to the role of social media in adolescent mental health. William and Catherine asked questions but mostly listened, recognizing that this family had hard-won expertise that deserved respect and amplification. When the visit ended, they asked Marcus and his parents if they would be willing to share their story publicly as part of the documentary project. Catherine and William were developing. The family needed time to consider. Understanding the permanence and exposure that would come with public disclosure, Catherine emphasized there was no pressure, that their privacy mattered more than any documentary. She gave them contact information for the production team and encouraged them to ask questions and set boundaries around what they were comfortable sharing, whether they participated or not. She wanted them to know their input had already been invaluable in shaping the foundation's work. A week later, Marcus's mother called to say they had decided to participate in the documentary. She explained that if sharing their story could help even one family recognize warning signs sooner, or one teenager feel less alone, it would be worth the discomfort of public exposure. Catherine thanked her profusely and assured her the production team would prioritize their well-being throughout the filming process. The documentary project was moving forward with several families who had agreed to participate, each bringing different perspectives on youth mental health. There was a family dealing with a daughter's severe anxiety that had led to school refusal, another family whose son had bipolar disorder and was learning to manage it through medication and therapy, a teenage girl with an eating disorder who was in recovery but still struggling, and Marcus's family, representing the particular crisis of suicide attempts and the intensive recovery process afterward. Catherine and William were deeply involved in the production, reviewing footage and providing input, while being careful not to direct the content in ways that would undermine the family's authentic voices. They wanted the documentary to be honest about how difficult these situations were, avoiding false narratives of easy recovery or simple solutions. They also wanted to include expert commentary that would help viewers understand the science of mental health and the evidence-based treatments available. The production process took months, with filming done sensitively and slowly to avoid overwhelming the participating families. Catherine visited several of the families during filming, not for the cameras but to check on them and ensure they were being supported properly. She brought small gifts for the children, remembering details they had mentioned in earlier conversations. She spent time with the mothers, recognizing they often carried enormous stress while supporting struggling children. One of those mothers, Helen, had a daughter named Sophie who was dealing with severe social anxiety that made school attendance extremely difficult. Sophie would have panic attacks on the way to school, physically unable to make herself walk through the doors even though she wanted to be there, and was falling behind academically. Helen had tried everything from gentle encouragement to tough love to bribery, nothing working as her daughter's anxiety intensified. Catherine sat with Helen in their kitchen while William played a board game with Sophie in the other room, giving the girl a distraction and her mother space to talk honestly. Helen described the judgment from other parents who didn't understand why she couldn't just make her daughter go to school, the frustration from teachers who saw Sophie as difficult rather than struggling, her own feelings of failure as a parent, unable to help her child. She cried as she talked about watching her bright, creative daughter being consumed by fear. Catherine listened with the complete attention she had developed through countless similar conversations, offering no platitudes or easy answers. She asked what support Helen was getting for herself, recognizing that parents of children with mental health challenges often neglected their own well-being while focusing entirely on their kids. Helen admitted she felt guilty taking time for herself when Sophie was suffering, that she had stopped seeing friends or doing activities she enjoyed because she didn't want to leave Sophie alone. They talked about the importance of parents maintaining their own mental health so they had resources to support their children, about the oxygen mask principle of securing your own mask before helping others. Catherine shared her own experiences with maternal anxiety, the constant worry about her children's safety and well-being that sometimes felt overwhelming. She acknowledged that her circumstances were vastly different from Helen's, but that the fundamental fears and love-driving parental anxiety were universal. Before leaving, Catherine spent time with Sophie, who had initially been too anxious to meet her. William had successfully engaged the girl in conversation through the board game, using humor and gentle teasing to help her relax. Catherine joined them for the last part of the game, keeping the tone light and fun. Sophie eventually opened up about her anxiety, describing the physical sensations of panic and her frustration with her inability to control them. Catherine asked what helped when Sophie felt anxious, and the girl described various coping strategies she had learned in therapy, some more effective than others. She also talked about her love of art and how drawing helped calm her mind. Catherine asked to see some of her artwork, and Sophie shyly showed her a sketchbook filled with beautiful, detailed drawings. Catherine praised her talent genuinely, suggesting that Sophie's artistic skill could be valuable in her future regardless of current school struggles. The visit lasted much longer than scheduled, as so many of their mental health-related engagements did. Time constraints felt less important than being fully present for people who had courageously agreed to share their struggles publicly. Catherine and William both understood that the families participating in the documentary were taking significant risks by exposing their private pain, trusting that the project would be handled sensitively and would genuinely help others. As production continued, they reviewed rough cuts of footage and provided feedback. They suggested additional context that might help viewers understand certain situations better. They ensured that experts interviewed for the documentary represented diverse perspectives and evidence-based approaches. They were meticulous about protecting the family's dignity while still showing the honest difficulty of dealing with youth mental health challenges. William became particularly invested in ensuring the documentary addressed. The documentary premiered on a Tuesday evening in October, BROADCAST, simultaneously across multiple platforms to reach the widest possible audience. Catherine and William watched it privately at Kensington Palace with their senior staff, wanting to experience it fully before dealing with public reaction. The 90-minute film was powerful and heartbreaking. The participating family's honesty, creating an intimate portrait of mental health struggles that was impossible to watch without being moved. Marcus's story formed a central thread, showing his hospitalization after the suicide attempt, his parents' anguish and confusion, and the slow process of recovery that involved setbacks and small victories. The footage didn't shy away from difficult moments, including Marcus crying in frustration during therapy and his parents arguing about how to handle his medication. But it also showed progress. Capturing the moment, Marcus laughed genuinely for the first time in months and his decision to pursue peer support training. Sophie's journey with severe anxiety was equally compelling, showing both the invisible nature of her struggle, since she looked fine from the outside, and the very real impact it had on her daily functioning. The documentary included footage of her having a panic attack while trying to go to school, her mother helpless to comfort her. That illustrated the physical reality of anxiety disorders in ways that statistics and descriptions couldn't capture. The other families' stories provided different perspectives on various mental health conditions, creating a comprehensive picture of how these issues affected young people and their loved ones across different circumstances. Expert interviews throughout provided context about prevalence, causes, treatment options, and the systemic barriers that often prevented young people from getting help when they needed it. Catherine and William's interviews were woven throughout, their comments providing personal reflection and call to action without dominating the narrative. The film belonged to the families who had shared their stories, the royal couple's involvement serving to amplify rather than overshadow those voices. When the credits rolled, several staff members were crying, and there was a long moment of silence before anyone spoke. The public reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Social media flooded with responses from people sharing their own mental health struggles or those of loved ones, many expressing gratitude for the documentary's honest portrayal. The hashtag associated with the film trended worldwide within hours. Mental health charities reported unprecedented surges in calls to helplines and visits to their websites. The conversation the documentary sparked was exactly what Catherine and William had hoped for. But there was also criticism and controversy, as they had expected. Some mental health advocates argued the documentary focused too heavily on dramatic crises, rather than the everyday experiences of managing mental health conditions long-term. Others questioned whether showing Marcus's suicide attempt and Sophus's panic attack was responsible or potentially triggering for vulnerable viewers. Media commentators debated whether Royal should be involved in producing content about such sensitive topics. Catherine and William read the critiques carefully, acknowledging valid concerns while recognizing that creating content about mental health meant navigating inherent tensions between raising awareness and potentially causing harm. They had worked with mental health professionals throughout production to minimize risks and include appropriate resources and warnings. They had tried to balance showing honest reality with responsible messaging, but they also knew perfection was impossible and that some criticism would come regardless of their approach. What mattered most to them was impact on the ground. Within weeks of the documentary's premiere, the school-based mental health program they had been developing launched in 50 pilot schools across England. The program provided on-site counseling, mental health education integrated into curriculum, and peer support networks trained by young people like Marcus. Early feedback from students and staff was positive, teenagers appreciating the normalization of mental health discussions and the accessibility of support. The bereaved parent support groups that had started with Sarah Mitchell and Emma Richardson expanded to multiple locations, providing ongoing spaces for families who had lost children to suicide to gather and share their grief without judgment. Catherine attended several of the groups over the following months, maintaining relationships with the parents and learning continuously from their experiences. Marcus completed his peer support training and began volunteering at his school, providing a listening ear and resource connection for other students struggling with mental health challenges. He credited William and Catherine with inspiring him to transform his pain into purpose. Though they insisted the courage and choice had been entirely his, he became a youth advisor to the foundation, providing input on programs and helping ensure interventions were designed with genuine input from those they aimed to serve. Sophie made slow but meaningful progress with her anxiety, eventually able to attend school part-time with support. Her mother, Helen, became an advocate for parents of children with mental health challenges, writing about her experiences and speaking at events to help reduce isolation and stigma. The artistic talent Catherine had recognized in Sophie continued to develop, and the girl began using her art to process and express her emotions in ways that words couldn't capture. The documentary won several awards and was used as an educational tool in schools, universities, and healthcare training programs. But more importantly than any accolades, it had achieved its primary goal of starting conversations and reducing stigma. Families watching had seen themselves reflected in the stories shared, feeling less alone in their struggles. Young people dealing with mental health challenges had witnessed others being honest about similar experiences, normalizing what they were going through. A year after the documentary's premiere, Catherine and William hosted a reunion gathering at Kensington Palace for the families who had participated. They wanted to celebrate the courage these families had shown and to hear how they were doing now. All the families attended, bringing updates about progress and setbacks, victories and ongoing challenges. Mental health recovery wasn't linear, and several of the young people featured had experienced difficult periods in the year since filming, but there was also much to celebrate. Marcus had been accepted to university and was planning to study psychology, hoping to eventually become a therapist who could use his lived experience to help others. Sophie was attending school full-time and had won an art competition at the county level. The other young people featured had their own successes to share, evidence that with proper support and treatment, recovery and thriving were possible even after severe mental health crises. The families had formed bonds with each other through the documentary process, supporting one another in ways that only people who had walked similar paths could. They had created a group chat where they checked in regularly, celebrating good days and offering comfort during difficult ones. Catherine and William had facilitated these connections, but the relationships belonged to the families themselves. Organic support networks built on mutual understanding and compassion. During the reunion, Catherine spoke briefly about how much she and William had learned from these families, how their willingness to share had educated and inspired countless others. She acknowledged that progress on youth mental health remained frustratingly slow at systemic levels, that wait times for treatment were still too long, and access remained inequitable. But she also celebrated the changes that had occurred, the conversations that were happening more openly, the gradual reduction in stigma. William added that the work was far from finished, that they remained committed to advocating for improved mental health support and would continue learning from young people and families with lived experience. He thanked the families for trusting them with their stories and promised that trust would not be taken for granted. He reminded everyone that the documentary had been possible because of their courage, that any positive impact it had created belonged to them. As the afternoon progressed, the gathering became less formal and more relaxed. Children played together in the palace gardens, while parents talked and laughed, sharing updates about work and life beyond mental health challenges. Catherine and William moved among the families naturally. It's more like friends than royalty, relationships built over many months of genuine interaction, transcending social boundaries. George, Charlotte, and Louis made brief appearances, polite and curious about the guests in their home. Catherine and William had been thoughtful about how to help their own children understand the work they were doing around mental health, wanting to build awareness and empathy without overwhelming them. They had age-appropriate conversations about feelings and the importance of talking about them, about how some people needed extra help when their minds weren't healthy, about using privilege to help others. As evening approached and families prepared to leave, there were long hugs and promises to stay in touch. Several parents told Catherine and William that participating in the documentary had been transformative for them, that sharing their stories publicly had been frightening,